to today's meeting of the Resource and Performance Panel. As always, there are one or two announcements that I must start with. So I will just go ahead and with these announcements. Webcasting. This meeting of the Resource and Performance Cabinet Panel will be filmed and webcast live on the internet and will also be recorded and published on the Council's website. All parts of the room can be seen or heard by the camera or microphones, and any members of the press and public present in the Council chamber at any time during the meeting are likely to be included in the webcast and recording. Members are reminded that seats have been allocated and programmed into the webcasting system. To assist with the webcasting, we ask that you remain in the seat allocated to you and that you use the microphone allocated to that seat. Please turn off your phones during the meeting. Now, exceptionally, in the current circumstances, I'm going to ask that we take a minute's silence in memory of Queen Elizabeth II. If we could all stand, please. If I might just say, speaking to any member of the public that's watching us this afternoon, firstly, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate the engagement. But just so that you know, here in the Council chamber on Sunday, we had a very impressive and solemn proclamation ceremony, which I think most of the people in this room attended. It was very impressive. And we also have a book of condolences in the lobby of County Hall, which is available for anyone to sign who may wish to do so. Thank you all. Now back to the announcements. Speaker scheduling. The speaker scheduling system will be in operation at this meeting. Members and officers are asked to note that microphones will not automatically go live when pressed. The meeting and order of speakers will be controlled by the chairman and administered by the Democratic Services team. To use this system, members must press their microphone button to indicate that they wish to speak. It will illuminate green, and the microphone will be made live when called to speak. It will illuminate red. For those members joining us virtually, please use the raised hand function on Teams, and the chairman will be alerted that you wish to speak. Please keep your microphones on mute until called to speak, and turn them off again when you have finished speaking. If required to vote on an item, please ensure that your camera is on and you physically raise your hand to vote. And just coming in there, I think I'm right to say that we have one member joining us virtually at the moment, that's Asif Khan. So just confirming that you're there, Asif. I can see you on my screen, so I think you are. Thank you. Yes, thanks, Asif. We see you. Thank you. We have a couple of substitutions today. Very grateful to Teresa Heritage for substituting for Councillor Ken Crofton, and equally grateful to Ron Tyndall for substituting for Paul Zakowski. The next point on my order of business is apologies. I don't think there will be any apologies. Yes, there is. There's one. That's Lewis Cocking, who unfortunately informed us quite late yesterday evening that he's not able to attend today. Thank you, Elaine. Member interests. I'm sorry, Paul.
Sorry, Chairman. We just saw Lewis a while ago, and he had another meeting, but he will be delayed. But he does intend to come to the meeting, assuming it will last longer than his meeting that he's on. Okay.
Very much. Okay. Thank you. Member interests. If they consider that they have a disclosable pecuniary interest in any matter to be considered at the meeting, they must declare that interest and must not participate in or vote on that matter unless a dispensation has been granted by the Standards Committee. If they consider that they have a declarable interest, as defined in paragraph 5.3 of the Code of Conduct for Members, in any matter to be considered at the meeting, they must declare the existence and nature of that interest. If a member has a declarable interest, they should consider whether they should participate in consideration and vote on the matter. So that's the formal announcements. We then get to item 1 of the agenda proper, which is the minutes. I'm going to invite members to agree the minutes of the last Resource and Performance Cabinet panel, which took place on the 7th of July. I'm afraid I can never remember if I need a second or a proposer and a second. So we just a nodded agreement. Yeah. Show of hands?
Yes, please.
Yes, show of hands. Thank you. Yeah, I think we're there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Item 2 is public petitions, and I don't believe there are any. So we then move on to the first main item of business for today, which is item 3, financial strategy, 2022-23 financial position and approach to integrated planning for 23-24. This will be presented by the Director of Finance, who is Stephen Pillsworth. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. This panel will have seen over the years a number of reports that outline the track record this council has in financial management, delivering balanced budgets over many years, including meeting and responding to the recent challenges arising from COVID. In February of this year, in this chamber, the council approved an integrated plan that included a balanced budget for 2 years, significant investment in services and priorities. And at that point, all our budget assumptions seemed reasonable. We'd put extra inflation in, we'd set aside nearly £9 million of contingency, and the budget had my sign off as Director of Finance. Then 2 days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. Of course, since then, we have seen economies across the world change significantly. And in the UK, we are seeing the impact on all households, businesses, public sector organisations, including councils. And of course, Hertfordshire's been no exception to that. And all of those issues, soaring inflation, rising energy costs, wages and costs of services, are putting huge pressure on our budget. I think it's fair to say that the scale of these challenges and the pace with which they are changing are without precedent. I've certainly seen nothing like it in my career. So for those reasons, that's why we're bringing forward this report to you. It's not something we would normally do at this time of year. You would have the regular quarterly monitoring reports, but the issues are so significant, we wanted to bring it forward. And I think that significance is exemplified by the forecast that this year we will overspend by £23.5 million. Extraordinary scale and figures. Managers across the organisation, though, have responded in their usual fantastic fashion, and I really pay tribute to the work they've done alongside all the other pressures they've got to bring forward plans to manage that and to actually balance the budget and offset that £23.5 million this year. And you will see in the report, alongside the use of contingency, those plans. Of course, risks remain for the remainder of the year. We are, of course, only halfway through, but I do think that's a fantastic effort to get to this point. The capital programme is also significantly affected as price increases in raw materials, energy and labour mean many schemes are seeing cost increases above the available budget. And you'll be aware there's been a few examples this year already where we've had to bring forward, particularly for some school schemes, proposals to utilise some extra grant funding to make sure those schemes can continue. Clearly, this is an issue that affects all councils nationally, and we've seen analysis by the Local Government Association and the County Councils Network, amongst others, demonstrating that. We in Hertfordshire supported the work undertaken by the County Councils Network, which was in turn used to lobby the government on those issues. Clearly, work has to continue around that, particularly with the new government, to make sure it understands the huge challenges Hertfordshire and indeed all councils face. Also in the report, you will see our concern outlined about the ongoing impact of these issues in future years, the fact they will continue in many cases and cause really pretty significant budget gaps for future years. So, of course, that's one of the reasons why it's so important that as an organisation, it looks like we have this year under control, and it means Cabinet, senior managers and other managers across the organisation can start focusing and thinking for next year and beyond. And indeed, they will now spend the whole of the autumn period through to Christmas developing those plans before we release our integrated plan in early January, hopefully with an outline that delivers a balanced budget for coming years as well. Thank you, Chair. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'd just like to say before I invite questions, I think everybody in this room acknowledges the scale of the challenge. I think everybody in this room acknowledges the huge amount of work that you and your colleagues right across the council have been doing in order to meet the pressures on the current in-year situation. So before we go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the work that you've done and thank you for it, and your colleagues. Thank you. That said, questions, if any. Got Councillor Jarvis and Councillor Tyndall in that order, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Two rather separate points. The first relates to section 7.3, where there's a list of the principal areas where there have been an increase in costs. And the first three, the additional 10 million on pay increases, the 3.3 million on energy, and the 2.2 million on highways contractual inflation are clearly inflation-related issues. But presumably the final two items, the 3.7 on SEND and the 1.6 on looked after children, where an element of those may be down to inflation, presumably a significant proportion of those are that the demand on the services has turned out to be higher than was estimated at the time the IP was put together. The second point relates to capital, so it may be easiest to deal with that one and then come back to the other one.
You're absolutely right, Councillor Jarvis. Whilst the bulk of the pressures are inflation related, certainly there's last two, there are elements of demand in there. Certainly so for children looked after, I think as it outlines a small number of additional high cost placements given the need of those children. And then within the SEND transport, exactly as you outline, it's a mix there of additional pupils requiring transport. Actually, in some cases, the complexity of their need, meaning the type of transport they need is more expensive. In some cases, distance, but also within there will be some of that is around the actual cost of transport and fuel issues. So a number of items in there.
And my second question and perhaps comment relates to section 8 on capital, and I noticed that wherever we've got some very detailed figures on revenue, the information provided on the impact on the capital programme is significantly less detailed. But it appears to me, it says that to keep within the funding envelope would require inflationary pressures to be contained within existing budgets. And I think we already have heard from Stephen Pillsworth that that's not being proved possible even this year, let alone likely to be in future years. And there's also an implication of a reduction of borrowing, and presumably that either requires an increase in income generation or a reduction in the size of the capital programme of something of the order of 10%. And whilst I appreciate that much of that would be in future years, it surprises me a little that we're not looking at areas where it may be either desirable or necessary to make changes to the capital programme in the current year, but there doesn't seem to be anything relating to that in here.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Jarvis. By its very nature, the capital programme and its spend tends to happen as and when those schemes come forward and need delivering. So they are, in some respects, different to revenue, which is day by day services. So in some cases where those schemes have issues and have come forward because we need to be getting on and delivering them, I mentioned the schools example, so we've had to bring those through cabinet to make sure there is sufficient funding for those to be delivered. And there may well be other schemes during the remainder of the financial year we need to bring forward in a similar manner to be able to make sure they can proceed and there is sufficient funding to meet the additional cost. But clearly, cost pressures are there. I don't think there are any schemes in the capital programme that aren't experiencing those. So as part of our review outlined in the report, we'll need to think about how do we meet that cost? Are there some options, extra grant funding or income, as you suggest? What are our top priority schemes in there? And might there be some elements actually we can simply no longer afford within the funding envelope? But equally, as you say, a lot of those are delivered either next year and beyond, and we can do the sort of review outlined in that section as part of the IP process.
Just to confirm my understanding, it's not proposed to do any sort of review of the capital programme in advance of the IP.
Directors are currently challenging their programme as part of that review, knowing that they can't afford everything moving forward. Where some of those decisions can be made as part of IP, that's where it will be wrapped up. Where actually there are schemes that the view is and the consensus and agreement of the senior management team is they need to proceed, then we'll have to look at solutions for being able to fund those.
Stephen, Ron.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm looking at the recommendations and the third bullet point, the ring fencing of 1.1 million of adult care services. My understanding of the phrase ring fencing means it's protected, but I have a feeling that in this case you're taking it away. Could I have that definition, please, before I comment?
Yes, indeed. And part of the reason we've separately identified that, and the terminology may not be entirely helpful. Chris Badger, as Executive Director of Adult Care Services, I've got his operational director here listening, so I better get this right. Clearly we've got concerns about demand and pressures in winter. So there is a contingency within the Adult Care Services budget in anticipation of that. Chris and his management team have said, we think at the moment we could release some of that, the £1 million, but clearly there are risks around doing so because winter is not yet here. So whereas some of the other items, and indeed most of the other items, the exec directors can say quite confidently we can give that up, Chris is saying, I'm prepared to put that on the table to meet the overspend and the challenges, but actually I may need to come back in due course in the winter and say simply the pressures are too great, I cannot release that and I need that back to respond. So yeah, apologies, the terminology might not have been entirely helpful there, But that's the thinking and the reason why we have just sort of separated that one out and not just absorbed it or summarised it within the other numbers.
I'm pleased that it's a cautious offer, quite simply because I'm cognizant of the second half of that paragraph, and I would agree with the comments there. We have a new health and care secretary. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether or not the pledge of the new Prime Minister to not follow through to abolish the new national insurance levy, which then would send all that expenditure potentially into spiral. So I'm not happy about it, but I can now understand it, and I would suggest that a different phrase for ring fencing is used when we get to the IP.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you. I think I've got next Councillor John Graham.
Chairman, thank you. I've got 3 points I'd like to make. The first thing is to congratulate the officers for effectively getting the budget for this year balanced for 2021-22. My only concern with that is that to do that, we're using reserves of about 10 million. I just wonder, does that give us a cliff edge, a hangover into the next year's IP? Because presumably there's going to be expenditure that's being funded by those reserves. And we know that when you've used reserves, they've disappeared and they're no longer there for next year. But unfortunately, the expenditure may be. So does that mean we're starting off next year's IP at minus 10 million, just on the challenges?
So we might take that question first.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're absolutely right, Councillor Graham, that those reserves, you say, can only be used once. They will not be there as a solution to the gap of £26 million next year. And I think it's a really important point because some people may think, well, if you've managed to balance an overspend of £23.5 million 1 year, closing a gap of £26 million the next year should be fairly straightforward. But exactly as you say, those reserves cannot be used again next year as part of the solution. And indeed, a number of the other options where departments have found savings by their very nature are one-off and not likely to be repeated. So we're effectively starting again in terms of savings proposals for next year.
Okay, so it all gets worse, doesn't it? And just to say on the, as I've commented earlier, inflation is a difficult monster to handle because although we got an average number, and I see that today the government published an average number to August of 9.9%, which is slightly down from 10.1, but we all know that that is an average. And I think in this paper we're seeing there are different types of inflation, aren't there, in different places. I mean, I've just tried to buy some fencing panels and they're exactly double the price they were this time last year. So materials, and you can appreciate that in capital is hitting the material levels very high. And then just coming back to the point that Stephen made, I note 7.10, which basically says we're sorting out this year, but what we're really doing is we're taking some of that risk money. That means that our risk of overspend is increasing. I thought 7.10 was a very good paragraph, Chairman. That brings me on to the third point, Chairman, about capital. And there is a large section in here on capital, and particularly I would draw attention to paragraph 8.6. But yet I don't see in the recommendation that there's any recommendation from this panel going to the Cabinet on capital. And I just wonder whether it might be helpful for us to consider a recommendation, something along the lines of paragraph 8.6. I don't think we should bind the Cabinet to that number, but there are 3 points set out there of the way that officers feel that is, maybe we address the capital budget. So I wonder whether we maybe put in a softening word like seeking to keep within the funding envelope, but maybe whether you might like to consider a recommendation going to Cabinet along those 3 dotted lines.
I think that's a very, very helpful question, John. Thank you very much. Let's see what officers say about that and then work out where we go with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Graham. And I think you, similar to other members, are right to spot and question the challenges we've got on the capital programme. In drawing up the recommendations, and given my response to Councillor Jarvis's question earlier, and how much of that will be about reviewing the capital programme alongside the integrated plan development, we sort of had that inherent in recommendation 3.2, which refers to the integrated plan, but agree that could be clearer. So a possible option would be, if people can see 3.2, recommendation 3.2, it approves the outline approach to developing the integrated plan and budget for future years, including the review of the capital programme outlined in section 6, and then continues in light of the significant financial challenges outlined, if that would be reasonable.
Yeah. I'm just going to look for a nod from Scott, just to make sure all officers would go along with that. Now looking at the room, I've got Councillor Ron. Did you put your hand up again? Yeah.
Certainly. Could I rate? Councillor Jarvis spoke earlier about the capital programme, and I've been looking at 8.1 and the last sentence. It says, in many cases, original estimates, either from IP or cabinet approvals, are no longer sufficient to deliver schemes. So I think that goes to the heart of what you were discussing earlier. And I just wondered, have you got a detailed list of historic capital schemes that have been approved, put in the programme over the last, say, 5 years or so, or whenever, that now will need to be revalued? And is that possible to share that with us? Not now, but at some point prior to the IP, because I do believe that I think the IP programme, the capital programme, may have to be visited quite carefully, because looking at the next building materials, inflation has reached 27.2%, and clearly I think inflation is going up, the costs are going up everywhere. So do we have a programme of a copy of the capital programme setting out the schemes that have been approved with the dates and the initial costings, and then the estimated upturn in those costings?
Before you respond, Steve, could I just slightly soften your question, if I might, Ron, just to take away the reference to 5 years. It's yes. It seems to me that what is clearly going to happening already is a review, which will in effect be announced as part of the IP. But if I might just soften your point that way, and let Stephen deal with it.
When the IP is published in February, that has a 4-year capital programme in. So that is, in many respects, the programme we are now reviewing. And just because a capital scheme gets into that IP, it doesn't necessarily mean the department can simply get on with that scheme. In some cases, those need to come forward to Cabinet for a more detailed business case for approval, and would also go through the relevant panel. If there are any schemes that need additional funding, and the thresholds are quite low on this in financial regulations, those would need to come through Cabinet for that to be approved, which is why you have seen those schemes I referenced earlier, those school schemes that have had to come through. So during the remainder of this year and ahead of the new IP being published, anything that needs a reasonable amount of additional funding will have to go through that process. Then when we publish the IP, as part of that, it has analysis in there which shows for all schemes that were in a previous IP, if there has been change in the budget for that scheme, what that change is. That analysis is in there, so you'd be able to see really quite clearly, portfolio by portfolio, which schemes have had additional funding put in, and as a result, are there some schemes that have needed to come out or be reduced in scope as a result.
In fact, the costings that you have in here are based on the totality of the capital schemes that have been initially approved. But that may not be the final total when it comes to February, if that programme has to be pared down in order to produce revenue savings on investment on the interest payments on that capital borrowing. Am I right?
That's right, yes.
Thank you. Right.
Oh, okay. If it's in that case, do.
It's just finishing where, because I felt that you passed my question over. The final point I was going to make was really enforcing what Stephen said. I think there's a tendency in here to think about next year. There is a section in here on future, but we do have a very well-established IP process. I think what we have to do is accept the officers of balance this year and let the IP process take its course going forward, because that's the basis we're going to solve the future years, and not try and solve the future years' problems today. We need to solve today's budget, don't we, today? No, that was all I was going to comment on. Thank you.
I've got Sally Symington next.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I also have 3 points I'd like to raise. One of them John has raised, and obviously it's going to follow on from what Stephen said. So on the capital programme, I do think, I'm not sure exactly what we've agreed. I'm sorry. I think we probably all agree that it needs to be referenced in the recommendation. Have we agreed just to take the words from that paragraph that...
If I might just comment,
Yeah,
I think we kind of have, but it might depend on, further comments in the discussion. So let's just hold and come back to it.
Right. Okay. Well, fine. I mean, we've already had quite a few comments about it, and as you know, I've raised this in past cabinet panels, and I think it is really important that as a county council, we set out for residents a fair and realistic programme of capital expenditure, and if that has it was already suffering from a number of underspends from previous years of quite significant percentages, and running to hundreds of millions, and I think if that has suffered, and obviously it is going to be impacted, and the reasons are highlighted, I think I really would welcome an early review of that. And I hear what you're saying, it's part of the process, but the process goes on anyway. It really needs to be highlighted as an issue of importance, so that, as I said, we don't go back to residents again with an unrealistic promises of what we're going to be spending. Some of the numbers, I've got slightly confused about the 120 million, because I had first of all just read it. This is in borrowings. There's a reduction in borrowings. But could you just clarify that that's a reduction in what you would have borrowed? But then I think, Stephen, you've mentioned before that some of it's covered in some of the programmes covered by grants, so that bit wouldn't be impacted. But the part that's more discretionary would be impacted. Could you just give us the numbers around that so I can just contextualise it a little better in my mind?
Councillor Symington, and apologies, actually, just the explanation I'm about to give, including in the report, may well have been helpful. So I mentioned earlier that we have a 4-year capital programme. The total cost of that capital programme as published in the IP is about £1.3 billion. A proportion of that is funded by government grant, by contributions from developers, but approximately 750 million is funded through borrowing. And then, of course, the interest costs on that and the repayments hit our revenue budget. What we're saying is, given that interest rates have increased since we set the budget, borrowing on £770 million would cost us more than we budgeted for. If we're going to keep within our revenue budget envelope for those debt repayments, if interest rates have gone up, we need to do less borrowing. And very roughly, at the time we were putting this analysis together, that equated to about £120 million less borrowing. To be clear, if you're doing £120 million less borrowing, you have to do £120 million less spending. So the simple maths around that would be we need to reduce that capital programme of 1.3 billion down by £120 million. Of course, there are some subtleties around that, and members have mentioned some of them already this afternoon. Actually, are there any opportunities to seek further external grant to cover some of those? Might some of those capital schemes actually develop income generating opportunities that we haven't yet taken account of or factored in that might help meet those additional costs. So that's all the fairly simple maths, but there are a number of ways we're looking to try and meet that challenge.
Okay, thank you. And I just, whilst on the capital programme, really wanted to draw in the comment, the observation 10.3, where the report itself says the capital programme will need fundamental review. I think we should be recognising that at some level in a recommendation that we will take that on board. I suspect other people comment on the capital item, and I think we can probably come to an agreement about what the recommendation should include. If I may, I've got a couple of other questions I'd like to ask. One is around reserves. And again, I know John's already picked this up. There are a number of, so he picked up the 10 million. If I was going to ask about reserves, I would pick up 9.8D. You mentioned using 82 million of reserves over 3 years. And another figure that comes out as being sort of pertinent to this year is that we will not use more than 5 million of the general reserve this year. I just wondered if you could kind of try and tie these together, and so that, you know, as statistics, they kind of make sense and fall together as a one item.
Yes, of course, and appreciate reserves are referenced a number of times in the report. I think what we were trying to do was answer the question of why aren't you using reserves to close this gap by demonstrating actually, as part of plans we've already put in place, we're planning to use a number of reserves in the coming year as part of a quite sensible strategy, much of which were already planned when we approved that IP back in February. So you quite right. I think one of the things also in 9.8, there's a breakdown there. So we planned when we approved IP in February to use some of the reserves we had, which effectively much of that was generated by some of the COVID funding we had that we hadn't yet spent. And we knew some of the costs we've got in the coming years are related to some of the ongoing effects of COVID. So it seemed perfectly sensible to release that from the reserve over 2 years to help address some of those pressures. We also know we've got a number of transformation programmes that were agreed as part of the budget plans, including in children's services and adult care, and some of our other projects such as Next Generation. So again, we'd already agreed to release from our Investor Transform Reserve the necessary funds to drive that transformation. Then, and this panel may recall, when we approved the outturn report for last year, back in July, we were already, of course, starting to pick up on these emerging issues. And we said, right, any spare money that we weren't anticipating last year from unused contingency and anything else, we need to put together, and we'll use that to help the position. That's the inflationary pressure reserve. And then lastly, as part of this challenge out to departments about how are we going to balance the budget this year, one of the things we asked departments to look very closely at was where they hold some reserves at departmental level, and whether actually we could release them. And that's the final number, the 10 million that Councillor Graham was referring to. Now, of course, that final sum is not in itself without impact. There'll be some areas where those funds were being held for risks, and if those risks materialise, we won't be able to manage them, or that they will hit our bottom line. So see in there was some funding we'd set aside for if more and more schools go academy, helping with some of the transitional costs for that. We've released that reserve to help with the position. So actually, if we do get more and more going, some of those costs will fall on the bottom line. And also we had a pot of money, £2 million set aside to support sustainable transport projects, some of the feasibility and investigative work around that. You know, we've had to use some of that to support the bottom line position. So that reduces the amount in that reserve to enable us to do those sorts of projects. So I'm perfectly comfortable with the amount, that 80 million. It seems like a high number. but a lot of it's been part of previously agreed strategies and approach. And it's more to demonstrate we are responding and looking and constantly challenging those reserves. In terms of the £5 million, okay, so at the moment the overspend is £23.5 million, and we've got solutions to balance that. I have been to the senior management team and in turn their department management teams on at least 3, possibly 4 occasions this year saying, sorry, something else has emerged, the overspend has worsened, can you find more savings and issues to help balance? And I cannot keep doing that throughout the year. They really need to focus in financial terms on next year and beyond. So what we've agreed is if the overspend starts creeping above £23.5 million, we will have to look at one of our corporate reserves to cover that. I haven't identified exactly which one yet, but what we'll do if we get in that position. But what we did say is that can't be an open-ended position. Actually, if we are in, and obviously I sincerely hope we are not in the position where the overspend worsens by £5 million up to 28.5, we will have to revisit that, go back to the senior management team and departments and say, sorry, it's deteriorated so far, we've got to go back and look at other options. But I'm very much hoping not to have to draw on that £5 million at all.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very clear explanation. And my third question relates basically to the whole funding. And you mentioned about you know, through the CCLA and all sorts of LGA, all sorts of organisations lobbying government to help local authorities. And this obviously is going to be incredibly important. But we now have a new government with a Prime Minister who has committed to reducing taxes. And I want, you know, so that's kind of that's the new world we're in at the moment. In terms of local authority, you don't have the luxury of central government of your tax base rising, because obviously we have a fix on it. We can only increase by 2 or 3%, including the adult care precept, and yet our expenses are going up with inflation. So I guess my question is, where do you see the lobbying going? What kind of response are you getting? And it's probably too early to say, but I'd welcome what your thoughts on that, and what you think longer term we can do to close the gap between a fixed increase in our actual our council tax against our cost base rising with inflation.
I'm going to let Scott pick most of that up, Sally, but if I might just come in to comment firstly. I thought you put that very fairly, and just by way of reinforcement, you're absolutely right. One of the things that makes managing our finances, I mean, on any basis, at any time, challenging, is that there are limits on our income, which obviously everybody knows, but we can't control demand. And when Steve Councillor Jarvis ran through 1 or 2 points that come out of the report, and quite rightly, it's clear in the report, the real big pressures that we are currently facing are absolutely inflationary. But Councillor Jarvis is right to pick out that the other 2 pressures that are picked out in the report are demand-led. We must respond to demand. So it's very, very challenging. And as to lobbying, we are lobbying, definitely. Letters have been written. I'll let Scott tell you all about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And and thank you for all of the questions and comments that we've covered this afternoon. Just to give the committee some confidence, the leader on all our behalf has been busy with his stationery set over the last few weeks since the Prime Minister was elected, with a letter to her, also a letter to the chair of the Local Government Association, and also the chair of the County Councils Network, really sort of highlighting all of the things that Stephen has highlighted and what we've discussed so far. And again, I think really the unprecedented move for us being able to put this report before the committee at this time of the year was more around that we wanted to be able to signal to both to members, but also to the members of the public that we can control and we can we're able to address the current financial year with a number of amendments that we've made to our budget. But what you're describing there in terms of at the moment, we have no detail about council tax policy in terms of caps or limits that the government will allow us to increase council tax by. And then that's still members' decision, ultimately in February, with all things considered in terms of what level they wish to increase council tax by. And we're also heavily geared to grant that the government will provide to us. And we're living very much on a year-to-year sort of basis with those announcements. So it's very difficult for us to make what I've described as more strategic choices if we knew what our longer-term financial funding levels were going to be. So, so through Councillor Roberts, we've written to a number of key individuals to try to either provide evidence in terms of what's happening on the ground here in Hertfordshire and the impact a lower level of funding would have on services that we can provide in the long term, but also to try to sort of be able to, I don't know, sort of give us a voice maybe to be able to influence sort of further government policy going forwards. And I think that just one example, just to highlight within the letter that Richard has sent, is that, that we've seen within street lighting, that 60% increase in those costs were obviously linked with energy increases. That's costing us £2.3 million more a year than we were originally forecasting. So, these are sizable sums of money that we're having to absorb.
Again, if I may, members, just bear with me. I think the lobbying that's underway is obviously entirely appropriate, but consistent with the way this county council has approached its finances for many years now, we are not going to make assumptions or presumptions that we will get extra government money. I think that would be foolhardy. We are preparing to manage our own affairs as best we possibly can, and we have, it has to be said, an excellent track record of achieving that. So we have some confidence in our abilities, but the challenge is significant. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to add to what Scott said about the political level lobbying, which is obviously crucial, but also to outline what happens at officer level to make sure government departments, civil servants and others really have a very clear understanding and evidence base of what's happening. So that happens in a number of areas. So I will liaise with colleagues in Society of County Treasurers, and the sort of information you're seeing here for Hertfordshire will be amalgamated to get that national view, which will be fed into DLUC around how it's affecting councils overall. And you'll see in the report also, for example, Mark Kemp as president of the Association of Directors of Environment, Planning and Transport, he will lead on doing that in those particular areas, and he and his colleagues there will be the sorts of people that Department for Transport officials will want to speak to understand what's happening. And similarly, Chris Badger as Executive Director of Adult Social Care is the resources lead on the national body there. So again, he can help play that pivotal role on behalf of the sector, quoting Hertfordshire examples in those discussions with officials to make sure they really understand in detail and supported by evidence what we're saying and what is referenced at high level in the reports and letters that go in.
Are we able to move on?
Me so many questions. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Councillor Terry Heritage, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking forward to the IP process, I think, because actually members will have an opportunity to really scrutinise, can we say, and it's going to be really, really important this year, especially the impact on capital, because as we know, the capital expenditure that's going on at the moment is actually there to alleviate the pressures that we have around the county. I'm thinking particularly of children. Can I just ask, in 7.3, we've got the evidence of the percentage increase in power, electricity, gas, etc., and the eye-watering 120% increase of gas. Now, last night I was talking to a local head teacher who is sort of mind-blowingly is 800% or something that they've been quoted in their increase in energy for the school, and that was just one school. So I wonder, are we, and I know this is not about county, but this is about everybody else in the county now, the question, are we actually working with the school system in Hertfordshire to ensure that they get the best rates they can around energy? Because that's obviously at the moment the biggest worry for them. And you know, this head of a main secondary school saying, well, we'll go under. We can't have our schools going under, because then we've got to pick up the pieces and find a place for the children to go. So it's a big issue. Don't necessarily expect an answer now, but I think that's something that you need to, can we know about what you're planning for the risk factor going through the year?
It's a really good point, because of course, actually this report focuses on the county council's budget. There is no reference in here to schools. And of course, schools in a lot of cases are facing very similar challenges. And indeed, Simon Newland, the Director of Education, brought an update into the Senior Management Board earlier this week on that very issue, outlining some of the challenges, not just on energy, but some of the other areas around pay awards and those issues, and what we need to do more generally around some of the support and monitoring we do for schools and their financial position. More specifically on energy, actually we have as a county council a framework contract that schools can access. So I think the vast majority of schools effectively almost clubbed together with us as the county council for a single energy contract to, as much as is possible, benefit from those rates from a bulk contract, rather than individual schools trying to negotiate their own energy bills. There may be some who well sit outside that, but I know a number of schools do participate in that. I think then more widely, there are some issues around wider energy efficiency measures for the council. And some of those we've been rolling out already, and indeed for schools. One of the, I don't know if upside is quite the right word, but with the increase in energy bills, some of those interventions and energy saving measures that previously might not have been affordable, or the payback might have been too long, now start to seem more attractive. So there might be more of that we can actually do as a result of this.
Now I've got just got two more questions in the waiting list. That's first up is Paul Mason, please.
Thanks, Bob. It was really regarding sort of the, I mean, I guess these figures that are worst case scenario. At least we're hoping they probably are. And we've seen a falling oil price over the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks, and I think the inflation figures today, which or the ONS figures that they've reported on for July, suggest that the fall in the July figures was due to the oil price. I just wondered, sort of real time, when we look at, are we seeing an improving picture in terms of that falling oil price helping us in any way at all at the moment, or just to sort of get that sort of, I guess it's a moving feast, the situation. So just wonder where we are sort of as of today as we're looking at them.
Yeah, I'm afraid to say this is our best forecast, and I'm always a bit nervous when anyone uses the phrase worst case scenario, because I tend to have to respond with, well, it can always be worse. And actually, I would hope some of the issues around energy do alleviate, partly because of hopeful reductions from the peak from gas prices in particular. But in the table that forecasts forward and has those gaps in, we have built some of that reduction in, but certainly I would hope that would be more. Actually, some of the other pressures, though, we are seeing are not influenced by that all price. So actually the biggest number we have in here out of the 23.5 million is around the pay award being higher than we expected. That's an offer that's been put on the table that will not reduce. At the moment, there is no acceptance of that from unions. There may be dispute, and that may not be where we end up. So in terms of the cost profile, I'm not entirely confident there will be much improvement on the numbers presented. But of course, during the IP process, we will challenge on that. We will pretty much constantly refresh those estimates because it's a rapidly changing position. And we will ask departments if there are any options to mitigate or offset some of these. Perhaps the area of major uncertainty and where the overall position may improve, though, is around that government funding and support. If that lobbying were to be successful, that would be the thing that would make the single biggest difference to these numbers and the overall position.
Thank you, Stephen. Ron, you close the show.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yeah, Councillor Heritage's question actually perked my interest up on our education. Now, clearly, we are all very, very concerned about the situation of schools, and I'm even concerned about the fact that there are some indications that schools may want to move to a 3 or 4 day week. But then what happens to those pupils who normally have free school meals, because they're going to be losing out at least 1 day a week of a hot meal? So that's beside the point. That's not today's question. Most of the senior schools and number of junior schools are now academy status, where the government decided to change the structure of education, and so therefore they're now the responsibility of the education department at national level. So I just wonder exactly what liability we actually have if schools run into financial problems. Surely the academies have to go to the government for more money and not to us.
I would agree with that. All my comments in response to Councillor Heritage's question related to the maintained schools where we do have that responsibility.
I think we're there. And what we now need just to reach a conclusion on is how we're going to, I think the mood of the meeting is we want something in relation to capital as part of the recommendation. I'm going to go back to John's reference to para 8.6 of the paper. I'm mindful that Sally's refers us, I think, to 10.3, or at least one line in 10.3. And while the conversation's been underway, I've been cross-referring 8.6 and 10.3. It does seem to me that 8.6 says, I think, what is the mood of this discussion. You're very welcome to refer back to it, Sally, if you want to, but the language is pretty clear. This is 8.6. This will require a major review of the programme. So I think we just need to decide on our wording here so that we know how we're going to work 8.6 into the recommendation. Sally.
Welcome the full wording of 8.6. I only proposed something slightly smaller because I didn't think you'd want to include it, but I'm absolutely welcome if you can put the full text in, and obviously we wouldn't oppose that.
Yeah, but that's fine. I rather assumed you'd say that. But let's see, John, you want to speak?
But my concern was not to tie the hands of the officers in any review that takes place. I mean, I see the 3 bullet points there as being principal bullet points. So that's I was suggesting that rather than say maybe the recommendation is something like that the officers seek to keep within the funding envelope by. So there's some scope. So we don't tie the hands on the review that's currently underway, but give direction in which this panel thinks it would be useful.
I can see that. I'm just going to look at officers because you have to live with this. You've got any comments, please?
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, and it is exactly 8.6 that are the parameters for that review of the capital programme. What I should flag, as I mentioned earlier, of course, is the outcomes of that will then be part of the integrated plan that has to come through panels, all panels, scrutiny, cabinet and council. So effectively, we're agreeing here the parameters for that review, not necessarily the outcomes from it. That will, of course, have to be properly approved through that process I outlined.
Okay, so John.
What I think it's important, why I want to include it is to give strength to that review taking place, but not to preempt the results of that review.
Well, it's a bit risky drafting by committee, but we'll try. So again, I think the mood, and I'm looking at officers because you do have to live with this, so do say if this is not workable for you. But I think the mood is to incorporate a reference to 8.6 in the recommendation, and picking up on your point, John, if members can look at 8.6, at the end of the, as it were, the first paragraph, the language at the minute is to keep within the funding envelope would require. I wonder if we might just modify that slightly and say to keep within the funding envelope we would seek to require. Are you happy with that? Just looking around the room. Sally?
Yeah, if I was to hesitate myself, I would say I think you might have solved the problem, but I think to commit to no new bids or investments being approved would actually be to the detriment of the operation of the council, and I wouldn't be happy if it went that far.
And I think, to be fair to the discussion we're right now having, if we were just to use this language, it limits officers too much, doesn't it? I mean, it's not an easy process that they're undertaking here. So I'm just going to say this one more time, just so we're okay. So in a minute, I'm required to read the recommendation. So it's going to be quite a long recommendation. It will be the recommendation as on the paper, together with 8.6 as on the paper, but modified such that the line I've already picked out will read to keep within the funding envelope we would seek to require. Okay, so I'm going to read the recommendation. Yeah, okay. Right, so the recommendation that we are going to take a vote on in a couple of minutes is as follows. Resource and Performance Cabinet Panel are invited to recommend to Cabinet that it notes the significantly challenging financial environment the Council faces and approves the following for the 2022-23 financial year. Savings of £13.4 million identified in Appendix A, which includes 1. Release of £9.5 million of reserves, including 21-22 carry forwards. 2. Release of £3.9 million of base budget underspends and efficiencies. The ring fencing of £1.1 million of adult care services contingency budget to help support the corporate overspend, with the acknowledgement of the significant risks associated with this decision, and referring to 8.6 of the paper, in order for the revenue position not to worsen further than already outlined in the report, it will be necessary for the capital programme to be reviewed with the aim that essential schemes can be delivered, but the borrowing costs can be kept within the funding envelope approved in the existing IP. This will require a major review of the programme with the aim of reducing the overall size of the programme and especially the level of borrowing required. To keep within the funding envelope, we would seek to require no new bids or investments being approved. Inflationary pressures would need to be contained within existing budgets, either through reprioritisation or delivering less. Reduction of £120 million of borrowing to avoid extra costs from interest rate rises. All those in favour, please show a hand. That's okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Asif. I hope you're hearing me. Can you vote? Thank you very much, Asif. Hands up. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. It's not quite unanimous because Councillor Cocking is abstaining because you missed most of the discussion, didn't you? That's fine. Okay. Well, thank you all very much indeed, members. I thought that was a very good debate. And if I might say, I thought the addition of the reference to capital was very appropriate and very worthwhile. So thank you very much indeed. Good. Okay. So let's move on. We're now moving on to item 4 of the agenda, which relates to temporary agency worker spend. And Richard Hall is with us. You're presenting this, Richard. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This report is an update on the council's spend on temporary agency workers. And the report was requested following an earlier discussion at the Resources and Performance Cabinet panel in May, where the item of spend values came up. The paper doesn't contain any decisions, and it is for information and update. I'm going to take the paper as read, but talk you through some of the key points in the paper and then invite questions. So it's important to note that agency workers play a really important role in terms of supporting the council in its staffing requirements. Spend on agency workers has increased in the financial year just closed to £12 million. That was an increase of 1.8 million from the previous year. And that is a reflection of the continuing challenges in the recruitment market, both for permanent and agency workers. We are forecasting an increase in spend in the current financial year beyond the 12 million experienced last year to in the region of £12.8 million. And the agency worker spend target for the council is 5% of pay bill. The current level of spend remains below that target, as the outturn is 3.9%. The biggest users of the agency worker contract within the council are colleagues in children's and adult services. And the main reasons for the increase in spend can be attributed to increased usage of agency workers and also upward pressure on pay rates. Certain skill areas are commanding higher rates in the market due to shortages. The paper contains an example of social work roles, whereby we've seen increase in hourly rates. From June 22, we will typically expect to pay £28 to £32 an hour, which have now risen to the region of £37 to £38. The impact on agency spend is not all necessarily bad. It allows the council to maintain delivery of its services and to manage peaks and troughs in requirement for staffing, and also help to cover short-term or specialist skill gaps in our workforce. However, it does come with some disadvantages in terms of lack of continuity of service delivery, in terms of changing personnel that supply and deliver our services. And some roles, agency workers can't discharge 100% of the duties associated in a role when compared to a permanent member of staff. So we have a large number of activity and work streams in place to try and manage the spend on agency workers. And that ranges from contractual discussions with our suppliers through to trying to reduce the need for agency workers through focusing on permanent recruitment. The permanent recruitment is seen to be a way of managing down reliance on agency workers, but obviously that is hampered by the current challenges in the recruitment market. I'd probably pause there and invite any questions relating to the paper.
John.
Chairman, on paragraph 4.4, I was surprised that you'd stopped at 2021-22. I presume you've got a figure approximately for 22-23 because you're forecasting 12.8 and you must have a forecast of the wage bill this year. So what's that number come to? And then when I've got the answer, can I come back, Chairman?
Yeah. So the forecasts shown are for spend on agency workers. So the spend on agency workers for the current financial year, we're anticipating to be in the region of 12.8 million. So that's a further increase from 2021. So yes, we are anticipating that to increase.
What's the percentage of the wage cost? Because the wages will have increased as well.
That's a good question. I don't have that figure, but I can supply that.
I'll give you an answer. Let me give you a suggestion. Because in the previous paper, we've seen very kindly, Stephen provided us with an increase of the wage bill. And if you add that to what I think the wage bill is based on 3.9%, and then take the number you've got of 12.8, surprisingly, you come out at 3.9%. So the point I'm making, Chairman, is if you look at the last 3 years, we've gone 4%, 3.5, 3.9, and we're going to be at 3.9. So great to see all the efforts we are taking on controlling the costs, but it reminds me a little bit of these monkeys that pop up in the holes. You know, you bash one down and a monkey pops up in another hole. So it's almost that in this organisation, we're running at an average cost of round about 3.9%. So can we applaud the efforts taken and recognise without those efforts we would see the costs go up, but that perhaps when we're looking at the IP going forward, we've got an approximate figure for where it's going to be over the next few years. Thank you.
Feel the need just to say, Richard, it's not being suggested that you're a monkey at all. Okay, thank you. Yeah, very interesting point there, John. Thank you very much. In this order, I've got Sally Symington and then Lewis Cocking, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Really interesting report. I'm going to ask one slightly technical question, and then I want to come back to something a bit more general. So one thing which the report doesn't take into account of, and it is sometimes people leave the organisation and they don't come back as an agency worker, but they are recruited back in as part of consultancy project. Is there any work done on the expenditure that might go on a consultant that has basically somebody who has left the organisation and then gets recruited back, maybe as part of a team to do the job that they were doing internally?
That's a really good question. This report focuses on the spend through the corporate contract with the main headline supplier as the guidance group. I accept that there are other arrangements where the services engage directly with specialist consultants which aren't included in these figures. So that may be an area for additional consideration to ascertain the spend value for those arrangements.
Thank you. Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that probably wasn't included in the report, but I do think it's, without giving you extra work, something that is an aspect of all of this. And it sort of leads on to my second point, or the other point I wanted to raise, and that is I commend the County Council for its agency spend, and clearly in a peer group it's standing very well. But the figure that possibly is less comfortable in this report is the 15% staff turnover. And I think as an organisation, this doesn't necessarily fall to you personally, Richard, but I think it's something that we should be looking at addressing, the retention of the staff that we have. And, you know, I think in previous conversations you've highlighted it is staying at this level. And given the economic uncertainty, I would be expecting to see that dropping off. So, you know, what actions are we taking to retain staff?
Very good point. Yeah, my first defence against managing the demand in recruitment is encouraging retention of staff wherever possible. So we have a number of mechanisms that help feed into that. It's not an exact science. Every individual has different motives for joining or leaving an organisation. Some of the tools we utilise are feedback through our employee staff survey to ascertain what's important to staff, in a view to help retain them, and also supporting managers with the principles of good management to ensure that people are satisfied both in the work that they're discharging and how they're treated as individuals. Additionally, exit interviews are utilised for some of our key roles, particularly in the social work area in children's and adults, to help us gain that intelligence. These are valuable resources that are scarce in the market, and we treat them like that to try and retain them.
Yeah,
Yeah, so from those interviews, what does it fall down to, pay or management, or what are you learning from that, just by way of a takeaway?
I think there's different pockets of reasons for people leaving. Sometimes it's personal circumstances. Typically in some of our social care roles, things like caseload are often considered, and we feed those bits of intelligence into how we design jobs to make sure that we're removing some of the drivers that may cause people to consider leaving. But it's really dependent on each role. So we are building up a picture of the things that are working to keep people in employment, and where we need to look at how we offer our jobs to help retain in some areas.
I'm just going to come in and say that, as I think everybody in the room knows, this council, all councils, most employers are under real pressure when it comes to recruitment and retention. One of the ironies of the employment stats being so good is that there are a lot of jobs out there that people can take. There's a big choice, and from our particular point of view, we might wish that was different. Recruitment and retention is a challenge, isn't it, Richard? Yeah. Okay. Got Councillor Cocking now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 points from me. So in 4.4, it would be good to compare the figures with another county council. You've compared Buckinghamshire, but they're a unitary. So obviously they've got waste collection and bin men and what have you within that figure. And obviously we don't. And I always think it's good to compare things that are like for like, just so it helps our understanding of it. And then obviously in section 7.7, you talk about all of the things we're doing to encourage people to join the organisation. And I appreciate what Bob's just said. It is an incredibly difficult job market out there at the moment. Employment is high nationally, so it is going to be hard. But all I will say is I think we need to do a bit more than the normal. I read all of those. I could have predicted we were going to do all of those anyway. So we need to think outside the box of how we can do that. But I've just qualified that it is incredibly difficult out there, but I don't want us to get in a situation where we're having to rely on agency staff even more. I mean, you've mentioned things like caseload and that. So if more people leave, the caseload for the staff that stay gets worse. So I just think we need to go around that loop again and think about what extra can we do to encourage people to work for this organisation.
Thank you. Exactly, a very good point. One of the big tools that we've got in our armoury is advocacy. So one thing that I talk to senior managers across the organisation about is the power of their networks and advocacy. So I was at a friend's barbecue last weekend, and a normal conversation goes, "How are you? How are the family? How's work?" And that "how's work" was my in to promote the organisation as a great place to work. And that's one of the areas that we've got access to within our management community to help spread the word of the council being a great place to work. So you're absolutely right. We've got to think differently and do things that other organisations aren't doing. I couldn't tell you exactly what all those activities are at this stage, but it's constantly under review.
Okay. Thank you very much. Everyone, I've got Asif. Sorry, Asif. Didn't mean to forget you. You got your hand up.
No, thank you. I think as many of you also mentioned the points that I was going to mention. I mean, I'm not one of those who think that agency is bad and permanent is good. You know, this binary discussion that people have, but you know, it may be to do flexibility and those things. I think some of the fellow councillors have mentioned the issue of recruitment. So my question doesn't need to, if you haven't got the facts, that's fine. So how many of those that are in agency position are due to lack of not finding those full-time members of staff? That is that recruitment problem. And are we sure that sometimes, you know, when it comes to the care sector, about the paying conditions that some of these agencies have with respect to their people who are, although you know, agency workers, are those paying conditions something which, as a county council, we would, are they similar or better than the paying conditions of the county council? I just don't want to have, as a county council, contracting to agencies where the paying conditions are worse than what we would give, because I know the agents take up a slice often.
Yeah, some very good questions there. So in terms of the reasons for use of agency workers across the council, the number one reason is to fill a permanent vacancy that is being recruited to. Behind that reason, we have project roles, so where there's a specific piece of funding for a project, normally a short-term piece of work or an area requiring a particular skill specialism, an agency worker would be used. Other reasons include sickness cover and cover for training duties in some of our frontline services. In terms of your second question around comparable terms and conditions, legally the council and all employers have to comply with legislation that protects certain terms and conditions for agency workers who are not allowed to be treated less favourably in terms of their employment package on things like pay. So we comply with those regulations, and also through our contract management process, we ensure that the suppliers that are used are reputable and have strong compliance and safeguarding standards that are equivalent to the council's policies or standards when compared to our direct recruitment.
Okay, got a couple more questions. I might just remind people that we've got another agenda item to come, so try and be brief if you can. So we've got Steve Jarvis, then Ron Tyndall, in that order, please.
Thank you. So, I mean, we've just heard that the majority of the agency workers are backfilling vacancies, although there are clearly some filling short-term or particular skills needs. And I mean, bearing that in mind, it comes as a bit of a surprise to me that the expected spend this year is going to be the same as a percentage of payroll as last year, because I suspect we've all heard from many parts of the organisation about the large number of vacancies and the increasing difficulty of recruiting people. And we've talked about some good ways of addressing that. And I'd just say that actually the best way to increase recruitment is to do less of it by keeping more of the people you've already got. But you've explained how you're doing that. And I wonder whether or not the reason for that is relates to the answer to Sally Symington's first question, that actually this isn't the whole picture, that actually there are people being brought in as consultants or via other routes. And I suspect that when we originally asked this question, what we were after was not actually what we asked for. What we were after was what the council is spending on bringing in temporary staff via all routes rather than just agency staff. And I don't know whether or not we've got 90% of the picture or 50% of the picture or what, but I think that was what we were trying to get at, is via all the routes rather than just via the agency route. And I suspect we didn't ask the question in the right terms to get that, but I think it'd be really useful to have that information.
Very interesting question. We didn't ask the right question in the first place, so it's very, very good. I think if there's a refined question, in all fairness to Richard, that might be something that he might take away and come back on, if that's okay with you, Steve. But I quite like the idea that we're not getting the answer we wanted because we didn't ask the right question in the first place.
Answer the question we asked. You know?
Yeah, very good. Okay. Ron, you had your hand up before.
I've noted your card. I can ask the officers direct.
Very good. Okay, so in that case, then I think we've covered the ground, and we move to the recommendation, which I will read. This is a recommendation to note. Panel are invited to note the contents of the report, including the reasons for increased spend, the flexibility offered by using agency workers on a short-term basis, and actions being taken to focus on recruiting directly to the council's vacancies. Do I need a show of hands for a note? It would be helpful. It would be helpful. So can we helpfully show a hand, please? Thank you very much indeed. That's unanimously noted. Thank you. Okay, now, as everybody will know, what we've got next on the agenda is the quantum care item. And I take it that everybody knows that because of recent events, it was the adult care panel was postponed. So the adult care panel members have not had a chance to debate this. So they have been invited to join us if they can, if they wish. So in order just to let people have a chance to come and join us, we're going to take, what is it? 10, should we call it 10 minutes? A 10-minute break. If we could all be back in the chamber all ready to go by half past 3. That would be really, is that okay, Scott? Yeah. Yeah. That would be really good. So everybody back to 3:30, please. Thank you. Still got a Steve, yeah, good. Okay, we are all present and correct. Good. So, yeah, okay, so we will now resume the panel meeting. And we're moving on to item 5. This is in relation to Quantum Care Limited contract variation. And I think this is going to be presented to us by Helen Maneuf and Christian Tizard. Please.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of remarks from myself to set the scene before I hand to Christian, who will walk you through the report. We have got some slides as well that Christian will take us through. And put very simply, our strategy in adult care services is for people to live independently in their own home as long as they possibly can do. And a significant amount of our strategic work is about how we make sure we can have the right services in place to meet that objective. And our nursing strategy, of which this paper is very much part and parcel, is absolutely key to that ambition. Because when people's needs become too difficult to meet at home, then nursing care is the appropriate solution in the vast majority of cases. So this paper discusses proposals to secure significant access to quality nursing provision to support that strategy. We've been working to develop our principles and proposals over a number of months now in discussion with Quantum. And we are here at this panel today. And unfortunately, as Chairman said, we couldn't attend Adult Care Services last Friday for understandable reasons. But we're here today to seek approval to go forward on the principles that we've set out and ultimately to agree a contract extension, which still needs some detailed work on our part before we get there. But hopefully set the framework in this report for how that will look. I'm keen to make sure we keep members brief. So as we get nearer to a point where we've got the final details of an agreement in place, then my intention is to offer a briefing of some sort to make sure that people have the opportunity to sort of look at the proposals before they are finally agreed. A final comment before handing over to Christian, just to underline really the fragility of the care market post-COVID, coming out of that very difficult period and the volatility and uncertainty we're seeing at the moment. I think this way forward that we set out in the paper offers us some surety and some certainty, both for residents, for our partner, Quantum Care, and for the County Council against what is a very challenging backdrop. Thank you. I'll hand over to Christian.
Thank you. So as panel appreciate, the papers are split into a part 1 and part 2 format. There's a considerable amount of information that relates to the specifics of a prospective future model in the part 2. The part 1 paper essentially covers the purpose of seeking a negotiation and a negotiated settlement with Quantum Care, and in particular the statutory obligations and the county council strategy that is driving that. So in terms of the strategic context, as Helen has mentioned, our strategy, because the Care Act requires us to provide the support where people need it in a personalised manner for people to live well and achieve good outcomes, is to support people wherever possible at home, but it's necessary where people become too frail to be cared for at home to provide residential services. So a bit of context around Hertfordshire's market. At the moment, the non-specialist nursing homes in Hertfordshire, of the 59 that are registered, just under 40% of those, so 39% of those are rated either poor or requires improvement by the regulator. So what that means in practice is a significant portion of the market that the County Council has to access in order to fulfil its obligations under the Care Act is deemed by the regulator to need improvement. Quantum Care, since its inception in the 1990s as a non-profit to take in services that up until that point were provided by the council, has been a significant part of our effort to provide good care to Hertfordshire citizens, both council funded and self-funding. It's been a very successful strategy, and the overwhelming majority of people that receive a service with Quantum Care do receive a good service. There's a large contract that the council has. The figures are in the report, but essentially it's over £20 million per year in spend for both residential and day services. And For historical reasons, it's been mainly older people that have been accessing those services, and there are a group of frail people who are under 65 who would benefit from this sort of service but haven't been accessing it because of the way the market has been working. They are Hertfordshire's largest care provider, and as such would be seen by both the County Council and ADAS regionally as a significant part of our care infrastructure locally. So as Helen said, the summary and the recommendations in the report are that we seek Cabinet delegation of a decision on a final negotiated deal with Quantum Care to vary the contract for an extended period. So that's a 10-year period with the potential to increase that to 15 years. We've taken detailed legal advice on the parameters of the deal that's currently being negotiated. And the advice is that we are well within bounds as a council in terms of procurement legislation and our wider responsibilities to treat the market fairly and to have equal treatment for all care operators, to extend the contract on or vary the contract on the terms that are highlighted in the Part 2 report. To go further into the detail of this, I would need to get into that confidential detail, so I'll pass to the chair.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Christian. That's very helpful. Thank you. We've got with us today Tony Kingsbury, who chairs the adult panel. Tony, I think it's right that we should just now ask if you have anything to add. Now I think, would be the ideal time for you to do that.
Not in particular, Chairman. I think the officers have presented this very well. There's been a lot of work done on this. I've been briefed along the way, and given the comments already made, I think that this is the right decision to be made hopefully by discussion today and by Cabinet, and finally when the final details are put in place. But as Helen said, I think we're very keen that other members are involved, and we can do a briefing as we get towards the end of that negotiation.
Thank you very much, Tony. Okay, I've got Councillor Ron Tyndall.
Thank you. Yeah, I support this initiative going forward for a number of reasons. The main reason being in these perilous times where we're not certain of the future of care because of a number of decisions that have got to be made by government, we need to be able to try and protect as best as possible the ability for the council to continue to provide a service to its residents. And so I think going forward, it's essential that this happens. The care market has changed over the years since its inception in 1990, when it was a good initiative for the council to retain the property, but get the Quantum Care to actually run the service for us in those homes, because that meant there was the council retained an element of control. Gradually over the years, there is now a need more for nursing and less for retirement homes, because, as the officers said earlier, most of the drive of the department is to actually keep people in their own homes, because they're more comfortable, they're in their own surroundings, they actually thrive as long as they receive the services. So in actual fact, we're finding now that the inhabitants of care homes now tend to be more on the high needs end, and that is why that market is changing and has changed and will continue to change. There are a variety of different areas that are being developed to meet different circumstances, but I believe this is a very important initiative going forward, because it does help to meet the council's requirements to meet the needs of its residents.
Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you. My own view is that this is an excellent report, not just because it's well written, but because of the substance. And it seems to me that this demonstrates extremely good foresight by adult care, the adult care provision of this council. And I think what it's proposing amounts to very, very good modernisation of the provision that we will be providing. And all round, I think it's just an extremely good paper. Just going to note that I think you said, Helen or Christian, and Tony's also said this, that, a way will be found to keep members posted of progress. I think that's quite an important element of this. But allowing for that all in, I think it's highly commendable. So thank you very, very much indeed. I've got no one else raising a hand, so I think we can move. Ron, that's okay. Yeah, come back. Yeah.
I did forget that it's actually quite a complex project. It's in its initial stages and there is quite a number of steps to go. And I believe it would benefit all councillors if at some point in the future, at a time to be determined by the officers at a stage where they identify where we're at, that they provide a webinar on Teams or something like that, that then they can show the project to the whole of the council in a very simple way. People can dial into it if they need to, but it would actually enable everybody then to understand where adult care services is intending to go.
Just come straight back on that. I think that's already on offer, Ron. Quite what form the further information takes, I think we can leave to officers and Tony. I might just say to any members of the public that are watching this, one of the things that quite a lot of people are either unaware of or are not fully aware of is the extent to which the Hertfordshire County Council is involved in adult care. And everybody in this room knows that we spend about £400 million a year on adult care. It's a very, very big part of what we do, and we help and look after a lot of people. So they're quite big issues, complex issues, and if I may say, I think we do a great job, and thank you very much for it. Thank you. So I'm going to move to a vote now. Well, actually, yes, indeed. Elaine has caught me. As Christian acknowledged, there is a part 2 paper here, but I'm not sure I'm sensing any need to go to part 2. Yeah, Sally?
Yes, sorry, I had held back. I just assumed we were going to go to part 2. And
You're assuming that we will go to part 2?
I had assumed that we would.
Okay, right, just hold that thought. I have to say, I'm not sure there's any other member in the room that was thinking the same way, but that's not to say we won't go. Okay, I mean, we all know what happens on part 2. It's just that we have to throw people out of the room. If you are, insofar as you're Sally, with respect, the only member that wants to go to part 2, is it possible that you have a question that you could take with Helen or Christian offline outside this meeting? I'm not trying to deny your democratic rights here, but you know.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'll just make a comment in that case. So I don't sit on adult care services, so I don't attend the cabinet panels. I can understand that from that point of view, this is a really, really useful report. I personally think that some of the financial implications are missing. I appreciate we're now not going to discuss them, and I would like to understand better, which I will take offline, the longer term financial implications of the. Well, I don't even know if I can mention it, but I mean there are financial implications which we're not discussing. So I'm happy to take them offline.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of cut across you. By all means, if you want to have a briefing away from this chamber from adult care services, I mean, absolutely, definitely, you should have one, and it will be provided to you. Okay, so we're okay, are we?
So, yeah, so if I can just say, I absolutely appreciate that it's the right thing to do for the council. I would like to understand better the financial implications, and I. Okay,
good. All right. So on that basis, then I think we have a consensus that we're not going to go to part 2. So it's interesting body language from the Councillor Jarvis there, but we're going to keep going. So I am going to take it that we don't need to go to part 2, and I'm going to move to read the recommendation. Okay. Elaine's suggesting that we should. That's all right. Elaine's suggesting we should take a vote on whether we go to part 2 or not. So I am going to propose that we do not go to part 2 for this item. So all those in favour? That's not quite sure. Have you made your decision? What do you know? Okay. All right. So did you count the votes there, Elaine? All those against? All right, fine. I think that's it, isn't it? All right, fine. So that means that we're not, John. Asif, sorry, Asif, I do beg your pardon again. Which way you're not going to part two, Asif? Yeah? Okay, I'm really sorry, apologies. So we're not going to part two, we've agreed on that. And I will therefore now read the recommendation, which is as follows. Cabinet panel is asked to note and comment on the proposal to vary the contract, including the alternative with regards to procurement, detailed in the Part 2 report, and recommend to Cabinet that authority for agreeing a 10 to 15 year variation to the contract with review periods throughout with quantum care should be delegated to the Executive Director of Adult Care Services in consultation with the Deputy Chief Executive and Executive Director of Resources, the Director of Finance, the Director of Law and Governance, and the Executive Member for Adult Care, Health and Wellbeing, and the Executive Member for Resource and Performance. That's a lot of delegations and consultations. Anyway, all those in favour, please show a hand. And Asif, I've got you this time, Asif. Thank you very much for sticking with it. So that's, I think, unanimous. Excellent. Good. Okay. So that therefore means that we've completed the agenda. And I think all I now need to say is that the date of our next meeting is the 6th of October at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you all very much indeed.